Good afternoon. How are you? Okay. Did you have lunch? I hope you had lunch. I tend to wander the stage. I hope that doesn't distract you or make you dizzy, but it's the only way I can breathe. I want to spend a few minutes opening up this discussion today about sport. And from the morning conversation, if you were there, you obviously saw a lot of references to sport already, which was fun to see. I'm going to talk about in the context, I actually have a book coming out in April. You'll all get a copy of the first chapter, which will be downloaded up there. And it's a reason why I mention it is not to make this an overt commercial. It is instead to say that it deals a lot with the structure of what I'm going to talk about today in the context of sport, because it's based on research I've done in over 40 countries. And in that context, it's interesting to look at what businesses and the world of sports is doing in order to create value for society. In other words, to influence. And if we're talking about the role of sport in soft power, that influence is really critical. We know that. And the question becomes, how does that happen? And in the research, it's been interesting. There are three dimensions to what successful organizations are doing to create what I call radical business or a radical sports perspective. They have three dimensions of value. One is value meaning, and I'll break this down for you further. Value meaning is aspiration. Why are we here? What's our purpose? What's our guiding star? Value measure deals with how do we determine that we're making progress towards our objectives? And then value mobilization is what are the actions and the activation tactics we're undertaking in order to bring our aspiration to life? And we'll look at each of these, but the key point behind it is that any organization that's going to have influence has to do all three of these things well, and that's what comes out in the research. If you are one-dimensional, the likelihood of you succeeding is non-existent. So now, let's break this down a bit more. Value meaning, that notion of aspiration that I referenced, this guiding star. What is value meaning? Let's go back to the 1930s, this country. And as Britain was making a transition from its empire into a different world, part of what was taking place at the government level was a question of what do we do as a country to raise our elevation or elevate our status in the world stage. Sport came up. And the idea was simple, was to portray Britain as a nation of justice and fair play and to support diplomatic objectives. This is back in the 1930s, and that's an interesting foray into this idea of what is meaning, what is our aspiration. It doesn't say, we need to have X number of Premier League teams or we need to have this level of revenues. It simply is an aspiration launched out there to say this will help us on the world stage as we as a country transform. Let me give you another story. I'm going to take you back in time. Some of the earlier work, David had mentioned, I've written some books, and the other books have been about sports and the Olympics and whatnot. And in that, there's a number of fascinating stories that have allowed those sports to actually rise to the surface of our international mindset. And this story is a true story. It's a story of a competitor. And this competitor, like many competitors, had a fairly sizable ego. And there's nothing wrong with that. To be competitive in sport or anything else, there's got to be a healthy degree of self-regard, right? And in this case, this competitor not only had that sort of self-regard, but also had a fair amount of influence, and in fact was able to get their favorite disciplines that they believed they excelled in included in their sport. So what sport am I talking about? I'm talking about the Olympics, but I'm not talking about the recent era. I'm looking back in 67 AD, and the person up here is Nero, Emperor Nero. And when he was Emperor of Rome and the Olympics were occurring, he did not like the idea that the Olympics were all about sport, even though they're nearly 300 years of only sport. It was a religious rite in the ancient Greek era. Instead, he wanted artistic competitions because he fancied himself a bit of a sophisticated intellectual. And so he wanted dancing, he wanted theater, he wanted acting, he wanted poetry competitions included in the Olympics. And yes, he did compete in a sports event, the chariot race, but that was the only real event that he took place in. That was part of sort of the original Olympics. Now, he did well in all of those, but he was emperor. So that has something to do with the fact that maybe he was leader of the Roman Empire at the time that influenced that. But the interesting part about the chariot competition, and maybe you know the history, he finished first, but he didn't finish the race. He actually fell off his chariot. But the judges sensed some level of catastrophic personal harm if they didn't declare him the victor. So he won at that time. Now, the real question here is this is not a morality tale, right? This is an immorality tale. But the issue is why did he assume that it was so important to win? And part of it goes back to the founding of the original Olympics and this notion that athletes stand for something greater than just the average things we go through day to day. If you do well, there's a certain amount of status that you gain if you do well in competition. And in fact, in the Olympics, in the ancient era, there were no prizes for second or third place. Only first place mattered. And so he had a perverse sort of incentive to try to make sure he won. Plus, as emperor, it would look really bad if he didn't win. Be less convincing to his fellow Romans. Now, that notion of first place has transcended and lifted a lot of sport over history. We've seen how FIFA World Cup and other sports events around the world have really celebrated this idea of status and stature for our favorite and famous athletes. But that meaning is also something that benefits all of us. When you think about what we celebrate in sport as fans, as athletes ourselves, we get an uplift from it. We celebrate the highs, we lament the lows, but we're part of that whole vernacular, that whole gestalt, that whole emotion around sport. And so sport has a real benefit for society. It's also had benefits over the last 50 years. Worldwide, we've seen youth sports leagues really blossom. Around the world, almost to a country, every country having sophisticated sports systems that give meaning to young athletes. More recently, COVID times have seen some interesting challenges. I'll only cite a couple of pieces of data. But in Europe, interestingly, if you were between the ages of 8 and 14, your participation in sport increased the last couple of years. If you were over the age of 14, it decreased. The flip occurred in the US. Over the age of 14, and participation grew dramatically. But under that, 3 in 10 people dropped out of sport that were in sport before. Now, that's obviously an anomaly due to the COVID circumstances, because the larger trend over the last 50 years has been this rapid increase because of the meaning it gives to the youth of the world. It's really had a big impact. So a question we could ask is, given the growth of sport, not just at the youth level, but the sophisticated professional sports leagues we all enjoy, has that ubiquity actually reduced the meaning and impact of sport in the world? Has it reduced its power to have influence? Don't know. We can talk about that today. The next measure, the second of the three, value measure. Are we making progress toward our goals? This is the easier stuff to talk about. It's the tangibles. Can we look at the size of something and measure its financial impact or its market share or anything else? Global sport as a percentage of global GDP, depending on what your definition of GDP is roughly 1%. That works out to about $600 to $800 million or billion dollars worldwide. And what are the factors that go into that figure? Well, we know it's athletes, right? And what do athletes do? Well, they attract fans. What do fans do? Well, they attract media. And what does media do? They attract sponsors and the companies that provide the hard goods and soft goods that all athletes get to enjoy. Now, this is the commercial aspect of sport. We recognize that it does have wherewithal to actually drive conversation, economically speaking. That's why you see the massive growth of the commercial side of sport. How about at a country level? I was delighted earlier this morning that Singapore came up so often. My background, I moved back to the United States in 2019, just ahead of the pandemic. Timing was terrible. But I lived for the preceding 16 years in Singapore and spent a good chunk of my professional life there. Really enjoyed it. And I got to see what happened when Singapore took on the F1 back in 2008, which they just renewed for another 7 years in the last month or so. And F1 was an effort by the country to raise its stature, because if you know anything about Singapore, you know that it doesn't have a rich tradition of sports at the youth level up until the last couple of decades where they really started to bring it into the school systems. So they always had sort of an arm's length relationship to that, and consequently, it didn't have that same sort of cultural magnetism that a lot of places have. They brought in F1, and just the numbers itself have been great for Singapore. It's only a country of 5.2 million people, but F1 by itself has generated $2.5 billion in revenue. It's brought in 1.5 million F1 tourists, plus another 500,000 plus of adjacent tourists, which has helped the economy further. So the value measure for Singapore, just in the context of F1, has been solid. It's been very important for the country. Plus, you may know this about Singapore too, they're driven to be #1 in everything. They don't always achieve it, but they're pretty good at it. It was the first nighttime F1 race, which gave it some additional notoriety, and that helped the country further elevate its status and stature in the world. Question for you, and we could talk about this in the conversations today too. Are there better ways to measure the impact in sport other than just the revenues, the currency, the dollars, the euros, whatever it might be? Final stage, value mobilization. The actions and the activation tactics we undertake to bring sport to life. Back to Singapore for a moment. F1 we've talked about. What else has Singapore done? Again, this little city-state, island off of the coast of Malaysia, brought in the first Youth Olympic Games in 2010. I was there for that. It was interesting to watch. They did it because they like being first in a lot of things, and they wanted to make sure that the Olympics had the Youth Olympics had a rousing send-off to the rest of the world. They did a remarkable job. It was a very successful opening Youth Olympic Games, and it gave them some bragging rights that to this day still works. And it also has led to investment in some really substantial new facilities that they've built over the past decade. This is their sports hub. It's a multi-billion-dollar complex, and it is as good as anything you'll find anywhere in the world. And it could host an Olympics if they wanted to. They have some other limitations, but it's a really phenomenal set of attributes that sport has given to the country. And again, using sport to kind of leverage the reputation of a country. So now, let me flip it to a different place. This is the United States. You may have heard of the Title IX legislation. If you hadn't, I'll explain it to you very briefly. Back in 1972, under the Nixon administration, the U.S. wanted to remove discrimination from sports participation for school-aged women. So anybody up to the age of 22, basically through the end of university. So they launched Title IX. It reduces discrimination and bias. What it ended up doing is taking what was once a population where 20% of the sports participation in schools were women to nearly 50% nationwide over the last 50 years. It's helped lead to increase in the number of women actually participating overall. You can see from 300,000 to 3 million. It's led to a really interesting seismic shift in the number of participants in the U.S. Olympic team. What was once less than 20% of the participants back in 1972 were women. It's now about 56%, so it's actually larger than the men's team. So it's been sizable in that regard. Where it hasn't been as successful has been in equalizing things like scholarships for students and growing the number of sports. It's grown it a little bit, but as I was talking before the start of the session with someone else, we have universities, for example, that have 45 to 50 different sports in men's sports, and it might be 20 to 25 in women's sports. It's still uneven, but it's definitely better than it was. And the point behind this is that the mobilization of the regulatory environment to create an even playing field that would encourage greater participation has worked, and it still has things to work out, but it's definitely made a difference in increasing that conversation around sport. Now, more recently, and of course it's been the topic of the morning sessions, has been what's happened in Ukraine. And we've seen over the past 3 weeks an amazing movement of the world's sports bodies to ban Russian athletes and Russian teams from international competitions. And the question you could look at in there is this ultimately going to lead to a cessation of the invasion? One only hopes. We don't know the answer to that yet, but it's interesting as a statement about the emotion attached to sport that it would have such a potential to impact. And what's interesting is you read this quote up here about Putin's objectives with sport. Sport was viewed very cynically as a means to kind of elevate the stature of Russia through any means possible. And those means aren't always reputable means. The sports bodies came together and said, enough. Now, final question, and we'll bring the panel up here. How do national actions affect sport and reputation? So I just want to set the stage with different thoughts with you there.